My uncle had plans to marry off my 11-year-old cousin, and I just couldn't stay quiet about it. I had to step in and speak up. Now, 2 years later, half of our relatives are behind bars, and the rest act like none of it ever happened, hoping I'll play along and forget. What really changed everything was teaching my cousins a whole new way to communicate, a language that ended up flipping our lives upside down in the best way. See, my family had this unspoken law when it came to women and their voices. Once a girl turned 16, her words were treated like they were toxic. Silence became her only option. They called it the silence ceremony, and it always happened right at midnight. During the ritual, your dad would pin you down while your mom tied a red thread, not through your lips, but around your wrist, meant to remind you to stay quiet. Step out of line once, and they'd throw you in the laundry room with no food. Do it again, and they'd yank out a tooth as punishment. No one ever broke the rule a third time, because everyone knew what could happen. In our world, a woman's silence was almost like a form of currency. The quieter a man's household was, the more respect he got from the community. At every family event, my uncles would treat it like a competition, showing off their daughter's silence like baseball cards. Mira hasn't spoken since January. Uncle Sanjay would brag, spreading his fingers proudly. Uncle Nika would lean back and smirk like he was holding a royal flush. That's nothing, he'd say. Priya's gone nearly 2 years without a word, he'd boast. At her doctor's visit, when they asked her a question, she didn't say a thing, just pointed at me to answer for her. Looking back, it sounds absolutely insane saying this out loud, but back then, it was just normal. And me? I was the exact opposite. Loudest one in the room, always. I couldn't get through a conversation without laughing at something, even when it wasn't supposed to be funny. I loved belting out lyrics to songs and making goofy noises just to get a laugh out of my friends. But deep down, I knew that if I didn't figure out a way around the silence rule, my days were numbered. Still, a part of me just kept hoping the problem would somehow disappear on its own. And then, out of nowhere, it kind of did. It happened during 7th grade, when Ms. DeCarter told our class we had to pick a foreign language to study. My ears perked right up when I heard that American Sign Language, ASL, counted as a valid choice. You've got to understand, my whole family had been living in the US this entire time. But once a girl turned 16 and made her vow of silence, she'd be shipped back to the motherland, no choice, no say. Once there, the expectation was simple: settle down and start having kids. So 3 times a week, I sat in Ms. DeCarter's classroom, learning how to talk without making a sound, communicating just with my hands. I felt this rush of adrenaline every time I signed, always afraid she might text my parents and spill the secret. If they ever found out what I was doing, I knew it'd be the end of me. Truth is, I had no idea what I was even going to do with these ASL lessons. Nobody in my world used that language, at least, not yet. Then Diwali came around. All our extended family flew in from the motherland to celebrate and eat at our house. It was supposed to be the happiest time of the year for us. But as we were eating, I noticed Priya sitting alone down at the far end of the table. Tears were quietly running down her cheeks, and she couldn't tell a soul why. She was 17, already a year into her forced silence. When no one was paying attention, I slipped her a glass of water and passed her a note at the same time. It read, "Meet me by the garden shed. Bring your sister." I told the rest of the family I'd seen a wrinkle in her sari, and I was gonna help her fold it properly outside. And that's how it all started. Every time we had a family get-together, while the men sat around watching cricket and the women moved silently serving food, I'd gather the younger girls off to the side. We were all just desperate not to end up like our mothers. First, I taught them the alphabet. Then came simple words. Before long, we were having full-blown conversations using only our hands. We even got creative with our practice, signing while we washed dishes, our hands hidden under all the soap suds. We came up with secret signals to warn each other, like a flick of the wrist meant "Someone's coming," and brushing your thumb across your palm meant "Save this talk for later." By the time I turned 15, we had an entire underground network going, 12 girls between the ages of 9 and 15. And every single one of us was fluent in a language our fathers and brothers couldn't begin to understand. The older women started to notice, but none of them ever said a word. Some even began learning by watching us. It all came crashing down at Ria's wedding. She was 15, marrying a 65-year-old man who specifically picked her because she'd been perfectly trained to stay silent. We were halfway through the ceremony when I caught sight of her 11-year-old sister shooting a hard stare right at me. Then I looked at her hands, and she signed. "He hits her." She even showed me the bruises. I looked over at Ria, standing there in her red wedding sari, unable to speak up for herself, not even to say no. Something inside me broke. Right as the groom was starting to say the final vow, I stood up. But this time, I didn't sigh, I spoke. Out loud. "She doesn't want this marriage," I said. "He's been hurting her." My mother's face turned pale like she'd seen a ghost. Everyone around me gasped in shock. The whole room just kind of exploded. Over 200 guests sat frozen, staring as I shattered the one rule you weren't supposed to ever break. My father yanked me by the arm, whispering threats about shame and consequences. But then, he stopped. because 6 other girls stood up too. Some of them hadn't said a word in years, but now they were speaking. "We know about the beatings," one girl yelled. "This is effing illegal," another shouted. And that's when I heard the sirens outside. I looked out the window and saw 2 police cars and a van from Child Protective Services pulling up. Someone had tipped them off about the wedding. I still don't know who made the call. The cops came in and started asking questions right away. They pulled Ria away from the crowd and took her to a quiet corner to talk. The groom tried to sneak out the back door, but an officer caught him before he could slip away. My dad still had his grip on my arm, digging in so hard I knew it would bruise later. All around us, the men were yelling at their daughters who had spoken up, faces bright red with rage. Meanwhile, the CPS workers moved Ria into another room. Through the open door, I watched them gently roll up her sleeves and check her arms. She was crying, but she was nodding, finally able to tell someone the truth. One of the caseworkers was snapping photos of the bruises while the officers started jotting down names and asking for identification. The whole room was tense like a wire about to snap. That's when Uncle Sanjay shoved his way through the crowd and grabbed his daughter by the hair. She let out a scream, and one of the cops was on him instantly, breaking it up. From that point on, everything changed. The police began watching all of us even more closely. The men couldn't lay a hand on their daughters with the officers standing right there, and you could feel how frustrated they were. Then the lead cop stood up and told everyone the wedding was over. He said there'd be a full investigation into the abuse allegations and the illegal marriage. The groom noticed that the police were busy dealing with the chaos, families yelling, officers trying to calm things down, so he used the distraction to slip away quietly. This time, no one even tried to stop him. Meanwhile, my father grabbed my arm and dragged me toward the car, his grip like a clamp that never eased up. He didn't say a single word, but the fury rolling off him felt like heat waves. My mom trailed behind us, clutching her prayer beads so tightly, her knuckles had gone bone white. She hadn't looked at me once since I stood up and spoke. All around us, the other families were rushing out too, dragging their daughters behind them, the parking lot full of slamming car doors and angry engines roaring to life. Inside our car, my father gripped the steering wheel like he wanted to break it in half, his knuckles stiff and pale. He told me I had ruined our family's name, that from now on we'd be pariahs, no one would ever respect us again. He said the other men would laugh at him, that he'd lost all honor in their eyes. My mom just kept mumbling prayers under her breath in Sanskrit, the words faint like whispers floating through water. I pressed my forehead against the window, trying to hold back tears, watching the lights of the city smear into streaks as we sped away. When we got home, my dad didn't even pause, he marched me straight up to my bedroom. He yanked my phone and laptop out of my hands and shoved them into his pockets like they were weapons. He said I was to stay in that room until he figured out what to do with me. Then came the click of the lock on the outside of the door, a cold, final sound. I could hear him downstairs, stomping around, making phone calls so loud they echoed up through the floor. Through the air vent, I caught bits and pieces. He was talking to my uncles. He warned them the police were starting to ask questions. He told them to keep their daughters home from school for the next few days, just until things blew over. He mentioned something about a family emergency meeting at my grandfather's house. I laid there trying to sleep, but all I could think about was Ria. Where had they taken her? Was she finally safe? I hoped, really hoped, she was. And I couldn't stop thinking about the other girls who stood up. I bet their fathers were doing exactly what mine was, locking them away like they were threats instead of daughters. Right around midnight there was a quiet knock on the door. It creaked open, and my Aunt Mira stepped in, carrying a plate of food, rice and dal still warm. She was one of the women who'd been silenced, but she didn't need words to speak. She sat beside me, gently cupped my face in her hand, and looked at me with tears in her eyes. Then she pointed to the food and pressed her hand over her heart. That was her way of saying she was proud of me, even if she couldn't say it out loud. She pulled out her phone and showed me something I didn't expect, a group chat. All my younger cousins were in it, texting each other. They were sending me messages, thanking me for speaking up, telling me they were scared. Some of them were already locked in their own rooms. Their fathers were furious, threatening to send them away early. My aunt left as quietly as she came. I ate the food she brought and tried to think things through. I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The men would regroup, just like they always did whenever anyone dared to challenge them. They'd find a new way to tighten their grip. The next morning, just as the sun was rising, my father unlocked my door. He told me to get dressed in my best sari, the blue one with the gold trim. We were heading to my grandfather's house. All the men were gathering there for a family council. That alone told me how serious things were. My grandfather was the one who started the silence tradition in our family, way back, 3 generations ago. The drive took 2 long hours, winding through country roads that seemed to stretch forever. My father didn't say a single word the entire trip. My mother came along too, still clutching her prayer beads like a lifeline as she sat silently in the back seat. I watched the landscape change, the city fading into open land, buildings giving way to endless fields and tall trees. My grandfather's house stood far from everything, isolated, large, and cold, like a fortress. When we pulled up, I counted at least 20 cars parked out front. Every single one of my uncles was there. Even some cousins I hadn't seen in years had driven all night to be part of this. Only the men had come. They were all packed into the main room, sitting cross-legged in a circle on cushions like it was some kind of royal court. My grandfather sat in his high-backed chair, stiff and regal, like a king holding judgment. They made me stand right in the middle of the circle. He asked me to explain myself, and I looked him straight in the eye. I told him about Ria's bruises, trying to keep my voice from shaking. I said she was just a kid, that the marriage was wrong. He laughed, cold and dismissive. Said I didn't understand our traditions. Said I was too young, too American, too poisoned by foreign ideas. The questioning dragged on for hours. They wanted to know who had taught me to be so defiant. They asked who else knew sign language, names, details, anything I could give. I kept repeating that I only spoke up for Ria, nothing more. Then Uncle Nikhil jumped to his feet, shouting that I was lying. He said I had corrupted all their daughters, turned them against their families. His face was crimson, veins popping out along his forehead as he paced like a wild animal. The room felt like it was closing in on me. My grandfather still sat unmoving at the head of the long wooden table, hands steepled in front of him. All the other men, my dad, my uncles, older male cousins who were old enough to have a say, had formed a semicircle behind him. The ceiling light above cast harsh shadows, making their faces look unfamiliar, even frightening. And then they started bringing in the girls, my cousins, one at a time. First came Priya's little sister. She was only 12, barely bigger than a doll, swimming in a salwar kameez way too big for her. Her eyes, usually so bright, were full of fear. My grandfather asked if she knew sign language. She looked at me for a second, then dropped her eyes to the floor, lips trembling. Her father smacked the back of her head and barked at her to answer. The slap echoed. She nodded, tears falling down her cheeks. And all I wanted was to run to her, hold her, tell her she'd be okay. But I was stuck in my chair, frozen. They brought in 8 more girls after her. Some admitted they knew sign language right away, their words shaky and soft. Others tried to deny it until their fathers threatened them, threats too awful for me to even imagine. Tara, who was 14, held out the longest. She kept saying she didn't know anything until her father twisted her wrist so hard, she let out a cry. The last one was Asha, just 9 years old. She didn't even understand what she was being punished for. She just kept sobbing for her mom, who wasn't allowed in the room. Over and over she called out, "Mama!" Her little voice cracking until her father snapped at her to be quiet. That's when my grandfather stood up. He said what we were seeing was a sickness, an infection that had spread through the family. And like any infection, it needed to be cut out completely. His voice was calm but full of finality, the kind of authority that had ruled over this family for decades. He announced that every girl who'd learned sign language would be put through the silence ceremony right away. It didn't matter if they were too young, it had to be done. He said these were desperate times, and desperate times called for desperate measures. The men all nodded, some quick to agree, others clearly unsure but too afraid to say anything different. They split us up, sending each girl to a different room. They led me down into the basement, a cold, bare space with cement walls and a tiny window high up that let in just enough light to remind me there was still a world outside. The walls were rough gray cinder blocks that seemed to suck up any warmth in the room. There was a thin, damp mattress thrown on the floor that smelled like mold, and a bucket in the corner I tried not to think about. My grandfather told me I'd be staying down there until I learned how to respect my elders. The door was thick and heavy, and when he locked it behind him, the sound echoed like a sentence being handed down. That first night was brutal. Even through the mattress, I could feel the cold seeping up from the concrete like it wanted to swallow me whole. Above me, the old house creaked and groaned, settling into the silence that followed the storm. Every little sound made me jump, footsteps, muffled voices, doors slamming shut. They left me one rough blanket, and I wrapped myself in it as tight as I could, trying not to imagine spiders, rats, or how long they'd keep me locked away. They kept me down there for 3 full days. Twice a day, someone would drop off a plate of cold rice, sometimes with a spoonful of dal on top, and a metal cup of water. They never spoke a word, just set the plate down with a clang and left. I could hear movement above me, people talking, maybe arguing, but I couldn't make out the words through the thick floor. Sometimes I heard what sounded like crying. I wondered if it was one of my little cousins. The guilt twisted in my chest, mixing with a growing rage. To keep from going crazy, I did push-ups and jumping jacks, over and over again. I counted them like it was a lifeline, 20 push-ups, 50 jumping jacks, then start again. I repeated poems I'd memorized for school. Hummed songs under my breath. I even practiced ASL in the air, tracing signs against the concrete wall where no one could see. The only way I could track time was by the tiny rectangle of light that moved across the floor from that window. When the sun disappeared each night, the darkness was thick and total. On the 4th morning, I heard a car pull up outside. The engine didn't sound like one of ours, it was newer, quieter. Then I heard unfamiliar voices. A woman, asking for me by name. Her tone was firm, professional. My grandfather responded with that smooth, syrupy voice he used on outsiders, telling her I was sick and resting. But the woman insisted she needed to see me. She said she was from school, my counselor. Ms. Carter. My heart jumped into my throat, torn between hope and fear. I heard the two of them argue. My grandfather's voice started to rise, not as calm now. Ms. Carter kept it steady, saying words like mandatory reporter and welfare check. Then came quick, angry footsteps on the basement stairs. The door opened and my grandfather barked at me to make myself look decent. The light from the stairway hit my face like a slap. He threw a clean sorry at me and told me to change, fast. He warned me that if I tried anything, my cousins would pay for it. His eyes were like ice, cold and dead. My hands trembled as I changed, trying to smooth down my messy hair with my fingers. The fresh clothes felt strange after 3 days in the same outfit. He waited just outside, tapping his foot with impatience. When I stepped out, he yanked my arm and dragged me upstairs. Ms. Carter was standing in the living room, arms crossed, her face serious and set. She looked me over, my tangled hair, pale skin, the circles under my eyes. She asked if I was okay. I nodded and said I'd been sick but was feeling better, even though the lie made my throat burn. My grandfather stood close behind me, one hand clamped tight on my shoulder, just enough pressure to keep me silent. Ms. Carter asked why I hadn't been answering my phone. He answered before I could, said the doctor told us no electronics while I recovered from migraines. Ms. Carter didn't look convinced. Her eyes narrowed as she studied us both. Then she asked if we remembered last week's ASL lesson. My heart started pounding. I knew this was it. My one chance. When my grandfather wasn't looking, I signed the word help, clear and steady. She didn't react, but I saw something in her eyes shift. Just the tiniest change, enough for me to know she saw it. She said she hoped I'd be back in class soon and left. But the second her car turned down the driveway, my grandfather hit me. The slap came out of nowhere, so hard my head snapped sideways and blood filled my mouth. He'd seen my reflection in the window. He called me a stupid girl and said I'd made everything worse. Then he shoved me back into the basement so hard I stumbled on the steps. I heard him on the phone again, pacing and yelling, panic rising in his voice. That night I couldn't sleep. My cheek ached, and my mind kept replaying everything, Ms. Carter's face, the word I signed, her reaction. Had she understood? Would she come back? Or was he right? Had I just ruined everything? I curled against the wall, holding myself still and trying not to cry. The next day, she did come back. And this time, she wasn't alone. She brought a social worker with her, Janet. Middle-aged, calm, with kind eyes and a serious face. They said it was a routine welfare check since I'd missed too many days of school. My grandfather didn't have a choice, he had to let them in. But his fake smile was stretched tight. He called for the aunts, told them to make the house look normal. Within minutes, they were cooking, cleaning, making everything seem perfectly fine. The smell of spices filled the air, dishes clattered, laughter forced. They cleaned me up again. My aunt yanked a brush through my hair and pinched my cheeks to bring color back. They dressed me in a bright blue outfit, neat and traditional, and whispered what I should say. My aunt leaned close and said if I didn't play along, they already had husbands lined up for every one of us. She pulled out her phone and showed me photos, men in their 30s and 40s, some already married, all from strict, traditional families back in the homeland. They planned to send us off within the week. I sat stiffly in the living room, trying to act normal while fear and fury churned in my stomach. The social worker asked casual questions about school and home life. I stuck to the lines they drilled into me, while my grandfather sat nearby in his chair, his presence heavy like a shadow over everything. But I'd hidden my ASL notebook under a cushion on my lap. As I shifted in my seat to answer a question about my favorite class, I let the notebook slip. Pages fluttered to the floor, months of sign language practice, little notes about teaching my cousins, even drawings of hands forming soft words. Janet leaned down to help pick them up. She didn't rush, took her time flipping through, her eyes lingering on the pages. She handed it back with a small nod that only I noticed. Then she began taking photos around the house, saying it was just part of the process. Her camera clicked steadily, capturing the locks on bedroom doors, the bars on the windows that my grandfather claimed were for security. She said they'd return for more visits. My grandfather's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile and said they were always welcome, that he had nothing to hide. Right after they left, everything spiraled. My grandfather called a sudden family meeting. He said the ceremony had to happen that very night. There was no more time. He summoned all the families immediately. Said the outside world was trying to rip apart our traditions, and we had to act fast. The men rearranged the main room, laying out ceremonial items with a rushed precision. They dragged us girls up from wherever we'd been kept. We looked rough, unwashed hair, wrinkled clothes, and eyes that had seen more than they should have. Some of the girls had bruises they tried to cover up. They forced us to bathe and dress in white saris. White, they said, for purity. But to me, it felt like we were dressing up as ghosts. Like we were surrendering. The fabric was stiff and cold against my skin. They lined us up by age in the prep room. I was the oldest, so I'd go first. I looked down the line. Priya was shaking, Tara looked furious but scared, and little Asha just looked lost, asking for her mom. As the sun set, the room filled with family. Long shadows stretched through the windows. The men sat up front, solemn on their cushions. The women lined the walls like statues, wrists bound in red thread, eyes glued to the floor. A low table in front of the men held silver plates, red thread, and scissors. The tools of a tradition that had stolen voices for longer than I'd been alive. Just seeing them made my stomach knot. My grandfather began chanting in Sanskrit. His voice was steady and deep. The other men joined in, creating a rhythm that made the air hum. Incense filled the room, sandalwood mixed with something harsher that made me dizzy. The smoke curled up like fingers reaching toward the ceiling. Then my father stepped forward, holding a red thread. His hands trembled a little, but his face was hard. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I looked around at my cousins. Some were quietly crying, tears sliding down their faces. Others just stared blankly, already practicing their silence. The youngest, who hadn't sucked her thumb in years, was doing it again. I thought about Ria, wherever she was. I thought about the women in that room, standing like shadows. I thought about Ms. Carter and Janet, about a world where girls had a voice. And I made my choice. As my father reached for me, I signed now to the others. We practiced this, whispers in the dark, silent gestures when no one was watching. Then we ran. The men hadn't seen it coming. We memorized which windows weren't nailed shut, which doors led outside. Girls scattered in every direction. The room exploded into chaos. White saris flying like birds trying to escape. I bolted for the kitchen. I knew there was a back door there. My uncle Sanjay caught my cousin by the stairs, yanking her scarf. She twisted free, leaving the fabric in his hand. 2 girls made it to the yard before getting snatched. There was shouting, crying, confusion everywhere. My sari kept tangling around my legs, slowing me down. I didn't care anymore. I hiked it up and ran. I burst into the kitchen. The women were there, cooking like always. Ceremonies never stopped their routines. The smell of dal and rice hit me in the face. They looked at me, wide-eyed. I begged for help, my words tumbling out. Most looked away, decades of fear in their silence. But Aunt Mira stepped forward. She'd always had a quiet strength to her, a subtle kind of rebellion. She stood in front of the door, blocking it just as my father arrived, panting from chasing us. He barked at her to move. She didn't. Just shook her head. It was a small thing, but it felt like the world shifted. Another aunt stepped up beside her. Then another. One by one, the women locked arms, standing between us and the men. For the first time in years, maybe generations, they chose a side. My father tried to push through. But they stood firm, their red-threaded wrists linked like a chain. And then my grandmother came in. She hadn't shown her face at a ceremony in years. She mostly stayed in her room with old photos and fading memories. But there she was, standing tall at 90, full of fire. Her long white hair flowed loose around her shoulders. The red thread still tied to her wrist, placed there when she was just 16, had faded with time, but it had never broken. Until now. She reached up and pulled it off. Her fingers, stiff with arthritis, moved slow but sure. And then, she spoke. For the first time in 4 decades, her voice cracked the silence. Raspy but strong, like a door creaking open after years of being shut. She told her sons to stop. She said she'd seen too many lives ruined by this. Watched too many bright girls dimmed by silence. She admitted she hadn't fought for her daughters, but she refused to watch it happen to her granddaughters. Her words hit the room like water bursting through a cracked dam. Everything went still, even the pots on the stove seemed to stop bubbling for a second. My grandfather looked at his mother like he didn't recognize her. But she walked right through the circle of men, and they stepped aside like the sea parting around her. Her steps were slow, but there was no doubt in them. She reached the ceremonial table, picked up the scissors, and began cutting the red threads into pieces. The sound of the blades slicing through them was sharp, echoing in the silence. Then she turned to the women standing against the walls. She told them they could speak now. That their silence had handed the men too much power for far too long. That she'd lived with 40 years of regret, 40 years of unsaid words stuck in her throat. One by one, the women began pulling off their red threads. Some cried as they did it, tears falling with years of buried pain. Others started laughing, quiet at first, rusty and strange, but full of life. My mom slipped off hers too, and then she said my name. I hadn't heard her say it in years, and just hearing it made me break down in tears. The men didn't know what to do. They were outnumbered now. And more than that, the moral high ground they'd clung to so tightly was slipping away. A few of my uncles tried to grab their wives, but the women wouldn't move. One of my aunts stood up to her husband and told him straight, if he pushed forward with this, she'd leave and take their daughters with her. She said the bags were already packed. She'd been planning this for a long time. Other women followed her lead, saying the same. What had started as a quiet rebellion in sign language had grown into something so much bigger. My grandfather raised his voice, trying to stop it all. But it didn't sound powerful anymore, it sounded desperate. He said tradition existed for a reason. That it had held our culture together. But his own mother just laughed, a clear, ringing sound like bells. She asked him what kind of reason justified silencing women. Asked if he'd ever once wondered what his wife might have said all those years if she'd been allowed. She asked him if he knew what his daughters loved. What scared them. What they dreamed about. He didn't answer. His silence said enough. And just like that, the whole ceremony fell apart. People started arguing. Years of frustration boiling over. Some of the men tried to keep things under control, but the women were done listening. My father just looked lost. Then my mother, her voice steady now, told him exactly what she thought of the life they'd been living. She said he'd used tradition as a shield because he was too afraid to think for himself. That she'd loved him once, but wasn't sure she still did. She said she needed to rediscover who she was, now that she had a voice again. Over the next few weeks, everything shifted. The family that had once seemed unshakable started to show its cracks. Some families broke apart completely. The hardcore traditionalists cut off those who had stepped away from the silence. Cousins got passed around between relatives as parents tried to figure out where they stood. But the network of girls, us, stayed solid. We messaged constantly, checking on each other, trading advice, sharing resources. We started a private Facebook group where we could talk freely. Ms. Carter helped several girls file abuse reports. She connected us with counselors and sings who respected our culture but wouldn't let it be used to justify harm. Some cases moved forward. Some didn't. But even just having that threat hanging over them made a few men stop and think. The community couldn't pretend anymore. Local reporters caught wind of what was happening. We started getting calls for interviews. My parents barely said a word to me at first. The house felt different, almost like the walls were trying to learn how to hold all these news sounds. Then my mom made a la parda the way I liked it, with way too much butter. She even made mango coffee, like she used to when I was little. She asked about school in this soft, uncertain voice, like she was getting used to using it again. She told me stories about when she was a girl. Before the silence. How she dreamed of becoming a teacher. How much she used to love singing. It took my father longer. But one day, he asked if I'd show him some ASL. His fingers were awkward and stiff as I taught him to sign. I'm sorry. Some cousins went to live with more open-minded relatives. Others stayed with parents who were trying, slowly, to change. A few were sent back to the motherland. But they had phones now. They stayed in touch with us. We kept teaching each other ASL, not just in case we ever needed to go silent again, but because it had become ours. Our secret weapon. Our freedom language. My grandmother became our surprise warrior. She went from house to house, telling her story. Telling the men everything they'd missed by not listening. She talked about the poems she'd written in her head but never shared. The jokes that died before she could say them. The advice she'd held back. She reminded the women how strong they were. Some listened. Some didn't. But she kept talking anyway, like she was trying to make up for 40 years of silence. The next big family gathering was Diwali. Normally it was huge. This time, only about half the usual crowd showed up. But the women who came spoke. They laughed. Their voices mixed with the sound of fireworks outside. Some still wore their red threads, but this time, it was because they chose to. The men didn't feel so big anymore. They had to share the space now. Had to let other voices rise. Ria was there with her sister. She was living with cousins who believed in education and freedom. She still had nightmares, but she was healing. She chopped her hair short, and wore jeans instead of traditional dresses. She thanked me for standing up. But I told her, we all did it together. It wouldn't have worked if we hadn't leaned on each other. We were each other's voices when we didn't have our own. We still taught sign language, but it wasn't about secrecy anymore. Some moms even started learning it, so they could talk to daughters who were still finding their way back to speaking. We made new signs. Signs for emotions that had been buried for years. For frustration. For joy. For fear that still sat with us sometimes. That language, born out of rebellion, became our way to heal. Months later, my dad and I sat in the garden together, the same one where he taught me to ride a bike, where we planted tomatoes when I was 7. That's where he finally apologized. He said he'd followed traditions blindly, just like his father before him. He told me watching Mom find her voice again opened his eyes to everything he'd missed all those years. He said he was proud of me, for having more courage than he ever did. He was still figuring things out, still uncomfortable sometimes, but at least he was trying. Of course, not everyone came around. Some families doubled down, packing up and moving to places where the old ways were still the norm. They said we were tainted. That we'd lost our roots. A few girls, some we'd grown up with, disappeared from our lives. Their parents rushed to marry them off before they could start asking questions or push back. We couldn't save all of them. And that haunted me. Still does. But we'd cracked something open, this wall of silence that had stood for generations. And now, finally, voices were beginning to rise up through the cracks. The months after that Diwali were strange. Some families acted like nothing had happened. Others completely fell apart. Then came the situation with my cousin Priya. She was only 13 when her dad tried to arrange a marriage for her, with some 35-year-old guy from back home who owned a corner store. He thought if he moved fast enough, no one would notice until it was done. But Priya had picked up more from us than just ASL. She recorded her dad talking about the whole plan and sent the audio to our group chat. We knew we had to move quick. I called Ms. Carter, and she wasted no time getting Child Protective Services involved. Within 48 hours, Priya was staying at our place, and her dad was dealing with an official visit. Our house turned into a kind of safe haven, a landing pad for cousins escaping messed-up situations. At first, my parents were overwhelmed. But Mom kept saying she wished someone had stepped in for her when she was that age. At one point, we had 3 girls living with us. Dad cleared out the basement, what used to be a storage space, and turned it into a real bedroom. Funny thing is, that same kind of basement was where I'd once been locked up at grandfather's house. This one had bright walls, open windows, and no locks anywhere. Then one night, Uncle Sanjay came pounding on our door, shouting drunk, demanding his daughter back. He was furious, hitting the door so hard it rattled the whole house. But this time, my father didn't back down. He stepped outside and told Sanjay to leave or he'd call the cops. They ended up shoving each other on the front lawn. Neighbors peeked through windows. Someone called the police. Sanjay spent that night in jail. After that, everything just exploded. The traditional family started organizing behind the scenes. They met at grandfather's house, planning ways to take back control. Someone from their side leaked their plans to us. They were going to yank all the girls out of school and ship them back overseas immediately. Plane tickets were already booked for some. We didn't have much time. Ms. Carter put us in touch with a Singh who knew her way around custody laws. Some of the girls were able to file for protection. Others had to vanish for a while, staying with relatives who had our backs. It turned into this strange, underground support network, like a modern-day underground railroad, only this time it was for girls running from forced marriages. The whole community split clean down the middle. At the local grocery store, families would switch aisles to avoid each other. The temple had to hold 2 separate services. People just refused to pray side by side anymore. A few of my uncles even tried to open their own temple, one that still followed the old rules. But they couldn't find enough people to keep it going. Then grandfather made his final move. He called for a meeting of all the male elders from nearby states. His goal? To vote on whether to banish all the families who'd rejected the silence tradition. He figured if he got enough support, the rest of us would cave under pressure. But grandmother had her own plan. She'd spent the past few months talking to women in other communities, quiet conversations, shared stories, building something bigger. And on the same day as the men's meeting, she hosted her own. Women came from everywhere, hundreds of miles away. They filled up a community center we'd rented. None of them wore red threads. The men's gathering had maybe 30 guys. The women's meeting? Over 200 strong. And this time, Grandma didn't hold back. She stood up and told her story, but she named names. She talked about which elder used to hit his wife for humming while cooking. She spoke of a girl who had taken her own life rather than live in silence. She had dates. Details. And every story made the men's excuse of tradition crumble a little more. She made it clear, this wasn't about culture. It was about control and abuse, plain and simple. Some women from those other communities went home that very day and took off their threads. Their husbands were livid, calling grandfather, blaming him for spreading rebellion like a virus. But our network kept growing. Girls from out of state started messaging us. Asking how to learn sign language. Asking how to say no. Dad lost his job. His boss was one of the traditional uncles. But then Mom got her first job in over 20 years. She started working at a daycare. Finally teaching like she'd always dreamed. Her voice got stronger each day. She started singing while cooking, not well, but happily. Then came the next crisis. Uncle Nikhil showed up at his daughter's school with 2 men, trying to drag her into a van. But we'd warned the school something like that could happen. They locked the place down instantly and called the cops. Nikhil was arrested right there in the parking lot. His daughter watched from behind her classroom window. After that, the threats got real. Traditional families started targeting anyone who helped us. Someone slashed our tires. Someone else threw a brick through our front window. Dad installed security cameras. Mom started carrying pepper spray. We didn't go anywhere alone and always kept in touch. But we didn't stop. Girls who'd already been married off began reaching out too. Some were able to file for divorce or annul their marriages. Others were stuck, but at least now they had someone to talk to. They weren't alone anymore. We even raised money to help some of them start fresh. My cousin Tara, who was 16 now and tougher than ever, kind of became our spokesperson. She started a YouTube channel, sharing our stories. Her videos blew up, not just in our community, but everywhere. She got threats, sure. But she also got messages from girls all over the world going through the same thing. And then came Isha's 16th birthday. Her parents were still traditional but were starting to soften. They planned a small ceremony, nothing like the old silencing, but still a symbolic red thread ritual. Isha went along with everything, right up until the moment it mattered. Then she stood up and gave this speech she'd been practicing for weeks. She talked about her dream of becoming a doctor. About how reaching that dream meant having a voice. She said she loved her parents, but not the traditions they were clinging to. Then, right there in front of everyone, she took off the red thread they just tied and handed it back. Her mom started crying. Then, without a word, she took off her own thread too. Her dad just stood there stunned, frozen, as his wife said his name out loud, for the first time in 20 years. And that kind of moment started happening again and again. Girls would play along, smile, nod, go through the motions, until that turning point. Then they'd say no. Some families took it okay. Others didn't. But every time one girl refused, it made it a little easier for the next. One by one, those birthdays were chipping away at the tradition until it was barely standing. Then my grandfather's health started to go. I think losing control over the family, over everything, just broke something inside him. He had a heart attack and was in the hospital for weeks. Grandma stayed by his side the whole time, talking nonstop. Making up for decades of silence. I'm not sure if he heard any of it, but she needed to speak. When he finally came home, he wasn't the same. It was like he'd shrunk, somehow. He stopped calling meetings. Stopped trying to run everyone's life. He just sat in his garden most days, watching a world he no longer understood. Sometimes I felt bad for him. But then I'd think about that basement. And the look in my cousin's eyes when she was afraid. And I'd remember what he helped uphold. That next Diwali, our town had two separate celebrations. One was for the traditional families. The other one, for the rest of us, was louder. Full of laughter and women's voices. You could hear it across town, a complete contrast to the quiet, somber event happening on the other side. Some families tried to do both, sending someone to each, hedging their bets, I guess. Ria got accepted into college. She was studying pre-law, wanting to fight for girls who grew up like we did. She still carried her scars, on her body and in her mind, but she was rebuilding her life. Her little sister lived with her now, far away from the marriage their dad once tried to force on her. My parents renewed their vows that year too. This time, Mom got to speak for herself. She promised never to go quiet again. Promised to raise her daughters to speak boldly. And Dad? He promised to listen. To really hear her. It wasn't a perfect marriage, but it was real. We kept doing the sign language classes, only now they were for fun, for connection. Parents, siblings, even some older folks, joined in. A few of the older women struggled with stiff joints, arthritis making the signs tricky, but they didn't let that stop them. They'd waited too long for a voice to give up now. Ms. Carter even got a state award for everything she'd done. She brought all of us girls with her to the ceremony. When they called her up, we stood and signed thank you in perfect unison, a whole sea of hands moving together. She cried and told the crowd we taught her more than she'd ever taught us. Some families just couldn't take the changes and packed up, moving to places where the old ways were still practiced. Where girls would lose their voices the moment they turned 16. We couldn't save those girls. But we stayed ready to help if they ever reached out. That spring, my grandmother passed away. At her funeral, woman after woman stood up and spoke. They shared stories of the first time they'd used their voice again. Of how Grandma had given them courage. Even some of the men admitted they'd been wrong. My grandfather sat alone in the front row, quiet and hollow, like he didn't know how to be without her voice guiding his day. By the time I graduated high school, that old tradition, the silence, the red thread, all of it, was barely hanging on. Some families still did symbolic ceremonies. Threads that only stayed on for a day or two. Others let go of it completely. A few refused to change, but they were getting fewer and more isolated every year. I got into college on a scholarship. I was going to study social work. I wanted to be there for girls who were still trapped in the kind of life I'd escaped. My parents were proud, though Dad still looked surprised sometimes when I spoke up at the dinner table. The network we'd built turned into something official. We got nonprofit status. Started receiving grants. We used the money to help girls leave abusive homes and avoid forced marriages. We ran workshops. Taught sign language. Held classes on knowing your rights and standing up for yourself. And the women who'd once been the quietest? They became the loudest voices in the room. At my last big family gathering before college, I looked around and counted voices instead of silence. 23 women talking, laughing, arguing, singing. My youngest cousin performed a dance to a song she wrote herself. My aunts argued about politics while stirring pots on the stove. Mom told everyone embarrassing stories about me from when I was little. Even the men had changed, well, most of them. They were helping in the kitchen, wiping down tables, and actually listening when their wives or daughters spoke. Some still looked a little awkward, unsure how to act. But they were trying. And that mattered. Change wasn't fast. But it was real. It was happening. I still use signs sometimes, when words feel too big or too tangled. That language, the one that saved us? It became a part of who we are. We teach it to every new girl who joins our family. Not because she has to know it to survive, but because she deserves to know it, just in case. Because now, our voices are ours. And we won't ever give them up again. As I packed for college, I looked down at the red thread bracelet still on my wrist. One final reminder of where we came from. Then I cut it off. and tossed it in the trash. I didn't need it anymore. None of us did. We'd found our voices, and no one was ever going to take them away again.